I wanted to remind everybody that we have the catalogs here for the fall term. So pick up as many as you need, but be sure to sign your name off so that they won't have to mail you one.
All right, so good morning, everybody. Good morning. So today we're talking about Louis XIV, also called the Sun King. I wanted to, first of all, that's okay. I wanted to announce too, I did last week, but I want you to know that I have a YouTube channel. I'm recording these lectures now, so if you look up Holman's history, you'll see the all of the lectures that I have recorded. Last week, I have to apologize, I totally messed up, and it didn't turn out very well. I would fire my cameraman, but he's a close relation, so I can't. What did I forget? Well, first of all, I have to make a correction. Last week, somebody pointed out to me that if you go back far enough, you don't call them British, you call them English. And so I had to look that up, and I was completely wrong. You do not refer to the British Navy or the British soldiers or anything if you go back beyond a certain date. When Scotland and England were united, that's when they became British. So the question is, when did they unite? Well, they united under a single crown when James I became king. James III of Scotland became James I, King James of the King James Bible. That's when the crown was united. But you don't call them British until the parliaments were united, and that was 100 years later. The official treaty was 1707. So they weren't British until 1707. Before that, they're English. So I just need to clear that up. So what I forgot last week, I had it on your handout. There's a quote. "There's plenty of time to win this game and thrash the Spaniards too." That was from an apocryphal story that Drake supposedly, when the Spanish Armada was spotted off the coast, off the Lizard, that he was told, it was announced, the messenger came and told them that the Armada was coming, and they were playing, he with his friends. Thank you. I'm glad you're here. We're talking about a Frenchman today. So he with his friends were playing at bowls, which was a game that many people played back in those days. And so the messenger came up and said, the Armada is coming. And so he supposedly made this statement that there's plenty of time to win this game and thrash the Spaniards too. That was a quote. That little story has been told to English and British children in their schoolhouses for generations. Historians, it's funny when you read about this and the historians write about it, it seems like they want to believe that it's true, but they doubt that it's true. Because the story didn't come about, it wasn't first written about for like 40 years after the fact. So it's possible that it's true. We may wish it to be true, but probably not. But it sounds like a nice story. Okay, so Louis XIV. And look at this costume. Isn't that something? I like to compare this painting with Henry VIII's famous painting, where he stands with his fists on his hips and this wide, very masculine stance, with Louis XIV standing like a fashion model, a woman fashion model, displaying his legs, standing in a very feminine posture, wearing shoes, and you can't tell from that picture, but if you look up here, with red heels, very feminine. That was the style that over the 100 years or more between the two, styles had changed so much. And the wigs, isn't that fabulous? Look at that. So, bibliography. The first one, Maurice Ashley, Louis XIV and the Greatness of France. This book was written in 1945, which, of course, is significant for somebody writing about French history right after World War II. And the title would make you think, and this is, of course, a Frenchman, the title would make you think that he's trying to build up everything French. And so this must be a book that's making Louis XIV out to be some great, magnificent sort of person, talking about the glories of France. And it turns out it's not. It's not denigrating France, but it seems, to me at least, a fairly balanced view of the age. So I was impressed. My emphasis today is going to be more cultural than political, because that's, for me, it was just more interesting. But this particular book stresses more the political and the wars that were fought. The next one, The Splendid Century. This book actually was assigned to me in college. I took a history of France, or Europe, course, and this was the book that was assigned, one of the books that was assigned to the class. And this one is more topical. So it's not just Louis XIV, it's more the age of Louis XIV. So it does talk about Louis and court life, but it also gets into the life of ordinary Frenchmen and the nobility and various topics along the lines. The next one, The Age of Religious Wars, is more a general history about the time in Europe rather than Louis XIV, but it does have a fairly decent chapter on him. The last one, Will and Ariel Durant. I'm sure many of you have known this. He did a massive series on the story of civilization. 11 volumes, like thick volumes. And he spent, 50 years doing it. And anytime you go to a used bookstore, you will see this series, either the whole thing as a collection or individual volumes. He's very good reading. If you talk to professional historians, they kind of downplay his skills as a historian, but he's really good to read, really fun. This was the age of kings. Historians often will write, when they write about this period, they'll call it the age of kings, because kings were coming into their own. They were becoming the absolute monarchs, which they couldn't have been earlier because of the chaos of the Middle Ages, and they couldn't have been later because of the rise of democratic philosophies around Europe. But this was the age of kings, and no king exemplified this more than Louis XIV. But you have Peter the Great of Russia, Charles XII of Sweden, and Leopold of the Holy Roman Empire as contemporaries. In the early 1600s, before Louis was king, you had Louis XIII, who was married to Anne of Austria, and it was a terribly unhappy marriage. They hated each other. And it was probably more Louis than Anne. He was a very difficult sort of person, grumpy and grouchy and not easy to get along with. And he wasn't a very strong person as a leader. So he had his ministers run the empire, run the country and the territories mostly for him. And at least one of these ministers you may know, Cardinal Richelieu, the famous, very powerful minister at the time. So infamous was he that Saturday Night Live did a series of sketches on him. Very funny if you haven't seen. And this was a time of almost constant warfare, whether with his neighboring countries or with the nobility that was always seeking their own power and their own influence in their own territories in France. So there's Louis XIII, very majestic looking sort of guy. Louis XIV, born Louis, another Louis, very popular name I suppose, was born after 23 years of marriage between Louis XIII and his wife. He was considered the miracle child because she had had 4 miscarriages up to that point. And he was born, and so his name was Louis, and you're going to have to help me. Where are you? Dieudonné, which means God-given. And then he had a younger brother, Philip, born a couple years later. When Louis was 4 years old, his father, who had never been in great health, passed away, and so he became king, 4 years old. Naturally, he had a regent. So there's Louis at 4 years old becoming the King of France. Looks like a cute little girl, doesn't it? So his mother became the regent in charge, and she was in love with the cardinal, who was the chief minister at the time. After Cardinal Richelieu passed away, they had Cardinal Mazarin, who was... Mazarin. Thank you. Got to get that right now, huh? Mazarin became the chief minister, who is not unlike Richelieu in his ruthlessness toward getting France together. France was very divided because of the dukes had so much power in their own little spheres and were very jealous of it. So years and years were spent fighting the central government, the king. And so naturally the king and Mazarin was trying to centralize the power, reduce the power of the nobles, and this was called the Fronde? How do you pronounce that? Fronde. Okay. Do you know what that is?
No idea.
Oh, okay. It was named for a game that was played. Young children would throw rocks at somebody and then run. And that was a silly little game that children would play, and that's how they related it to the nobility, where they would pick at the king and flee. And so there were a series of these civil wars that really took its toll on France. Naturally, wars are always very expensive, And so taxes have to be very high. And the worst of it, of course, is that who pays the taxes? It is not the nobility. It's always the lower classes. Everybody else was exempt. And so it fell on those who were least able to pay, and since they didn't have newspapers or the internet, nobody heard them complain until they rioted in the streets. And that's what they did eventually, from time to time actually. It wasn't just one time. This is just, I'm trying to find a painting of Paris revolting, and it's interesting. You'll get lots of different pictures because Paris has revolted many times. And one of the first things they do is throw up barriers in the streets to keep the military from passing through. So this is a painting of one of the many Paris revolts down through the ages. So what did Louis learn? He learned that he was going to be an absolute monarch. He learned not to trust the nobility, and that he was going to be noble and dignified at all times. As he presented himself to his subjects, and everyone was his subject, he was going to be a king, every inch a king, and I love that phrase, every inch a king, always for Louis. And he established his rules of etiquette and his rituals daily without fail, so that everyone would see that he was not just an ordinary human being. He was a king. He was an absolute king. One other thing, during this regency, historians will always make note of the fact that his education was lacking, and he was not well taken care of or well supervised. And so he was a kid who could run around and pretty much do as he likes with his friends. And so as he got older, he did not like to read. He regretted this when he became king as he got older. And his education wasn't completely lacking. He was educated. He actually enjoyed history. But it was usually read to him. So he certainly could read, and he could speak a couple of languages, but he never really learned Latin well. He learned it superficially. And so as he got older, he realized that Latin is the international language, the language of diplomacy in those days. And so he really regretted not learning his Latin well. Louis was a lover. He loved women. And his first love, and some historians will say his only love, though I doubt this, Marie Mancini, she was of the lower nobility. He was 16, 17, 18. They fell in love. He wanted to marry her, and he was begging his mother and Cardinal Mazarin that he wanted to marry this woman. And they told him no. His mother was irate. You do not have the choice of your own wife. You have a duty to the state, and that is all important. And so you are going to marry Maria Theresa of Spain, who was, of course, the daughter of the King and Queen of Spain. And that is going to end a war. Pretty crazy to think about. You could either marry an ordinary woman, or you could end a war with marrying someone else. The that you've never met. And as king, he had to follow his duty, and that was to marry someone he didn't know, never met, because this was a diplomatic necessity. It ended a war with Spain. So they had the Peace of the Pyrenees. And here's Maria Theresa of Spain. Interesting hairdo there. That was more the Spanish style, I suppose. And this is the ritual of Maria Theresa coming to France to become the Queen of France. You'll notice this is kind of an outdoors scene that is covered with some sort of building, and you have on one side Spain, on the other side France. Different styles of carpet, you can tell. And so this whole elaborate ritual of her crossing into France to become the Queen of France. You'd probably spend a whole hour just discussing the intricacies of such a ritual.
You know how you can tell it's a wedding in Appalachia? Everybody sits on the same side of the aisle.
Oh.
Which side? Or does it matter?
Doesn't matter.
Okay, so Cardinal Mazarin is dead. And in 1661, Louis is 21 years old at this time. Louis, who had been neglected in many ways growing up, yet considered the cardinal kind of a stepfather. The cardinal and his mother, some people think that they were secretly married, which wouldn't really make sense, him being a cardinal and all, but they were probably lovers, and he was very much a father figure to Louis. So, at 22 years old, Louis, who appeared a lot taller than he was, they say, he was 5'5", which is only probably slightly shorter than average. I think the average height at the time for a man was probably more like 5'6", maybe 5'7". So he was slightly shorter than average, but with those fantastic heels of his, he would raise himself up a bit. Everyone would report about how personable, polite, dignified, and proud he came across. Always. You would almost never see him lose his temper. And there's a really neat quote on that I put there. If I were not king, I should be angry. And he stated that he was very fearful of committing the slightest fault. He is a king. He is not allowed to make any mistakes in his own mind. And so that was something that was always a part of him. As he spoke to people, he was very deliberate, very thoughtful. He would not want a single word, careless word, escape his lips. He wanted everything done to perfection. And here's the coronation painting of Louis XIV. Looks very young, doesn't he? Still looks something like a girl, though. Very pretty. And when Louis became king at 22, he surprised everybody by really taking charge. It was commonplace at the time for kings to rely on their ministers. Not unusual for a king to almost completely give up the power if not the presence of being a king to the ministers. It would be fairly typical for a king to spend maybe an hour or so on national business and then spend the rest of the time enjoying himself. Immediately, King Louis said that he was going to be his own prime minister. He was not going to allow anybody to take that power from him. One of the things that they said that he would often, just as a comment, if somebody suggests that he do something that he was not going to do, he would say something like, "I'd sooner get a prime minister than to do that." He presided over his own councils, and he worked 6 to 9 hours a day. Today, we don't think that sounds like an awful lot. In those days, it was. It was quite a lot for a king to spend so much time doing administrative business. But he was very conscientious in that way. He had a keen sense of justice in his own mind, at least, according to his own style or theory of justice. He was very precise and would even stand up for people who he did not like if he felt that justice was needed in such a case. And he listened to the grievances of the people of France. When he received messages, he would take it to heart. And if somebody complained about some judge out in some province that was being unjust, he would look into it. And then, of course, there is the Palace of Versailles. How many of you have been there? Now, here's a place I have actually been. Several years ago, my wife and I were able to go to France, and we toured the palace. It was originally an old hunting lodge of his father, and he decided he was going to make it a very grand place. Spent 10 years in the kind of the core building. Some will tell you that it took 50 years to build, but it's one of those things where it's always an ongoing, something needs to be done or built, but the core palace was built in roughly 10 years, and everyone knew that it was the greatest palace in Europe. And it was built not to be comfortable. It was built to be magnificent. Back in those days, they didn't think along the lines of you need to be comfortable. Almost nobody did. Certainly not the king, who was all about his duty and not comforts. So the palace was not comfortable, but it was something that everyone wanted to be there. And this is the way, in a very sly sort of manner, that Louis kept the nobility from bothering him. He gave them Versailles, the toys, the favors, the splendor of Versailles. And that's how Louis kept the nobility from rising up against him. And he could keep an eye on them. And it was not just, hey, this is a nice place to come. It's more like, you are going to live here. And it is my order that you live here for certain of the nobles. And so they did. And it was a great honor. At the palace and the surrounding village, there were 10,000 and more people, whether servants or the nobility and their attendants, 10,000 plus people who lived at that site. And throughout France, anyone who had the privilege, the honor of being even near Versailles, much less be inside of it, was the utmost greatest honor of their lives. There's Versailles. And I had to throw in a bunch of pictures of Versailles just because you really can't get an idea of it with one or two pictures or even a bunch of pictures. But this gives you something of an idea of the splendor of Versailles. And this, of course, the most famous room. Who knows what this is called?
Hall of Mirrors.
The Hall of Mirrors. World War I, the Treaty of Versailles was signed here. Although it's one of those pictures that I think it looks better in a picture than it does in real life. When you're there, it's like, okay, this didn't really seem like it's that great of a thing. But in a picture, it looks fantastic. And then we have the king's bedroom. You'd think that the sight of so much gold would just blind you. But that's the king's room, where so many nobles would stand and gawk at everything he did. And then you have the gardens and the statues that are just fantastic too. And interestingly, one of the things that stands out as something that was named for King Louis XIV is the furniture. You can look this up, Louis XIV furniture, and it's all, of course, very ornate, a lot of gold, and of course we know at the time in Europe, what is the style that everybody's pursuing? The Baroque, at this time, Rococo, I think later, but this was the age of Baroque, where everything was very ornate. Court etiquette. How many of you ever seen, who's that woman who would write books on etiquette?
Miss Madeline.
Miss Emily Post. Really thick books. And you think, how much etiquette does one person need? But that would be something that Louis XIV would pass out. Really thick manuals that you better know. Otherwise, you could be banished from Versailles. And one of these is that you do not knock on a door at Versailles. You use your left pinky, for which you would grow the nail out, and you scratch on the door. That's how you announce that somebody's at the door. You are always formal. For those of you who know other languages, very commonly in other languages, there is the formal address and the informal. In English, most everything is informal. But I would think a comparison might be if you are talking to someone, anyone, even if it's your close friend or your brother or your father or your mother, it's always Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so. It's never, hey Bob, how you doing? You are always formal. The king's food, it is prepared several hundred yards away from where the king eats, in his room when he eats there. As it passes by, you must bow to it as if you were bowing to the king himself. The king didn't like foul language. He didn't like drunkenness, and anything that smacked of bad manners, the king just hated. The slightest breach in protocol, he would give you the evil eye and maybe later let you know that you are not welcome here anymore. just one of the things that I thought this was a neat painting of people bowing and scraping before the young king as a perfectly acceptable way of presenting yourself. One of the things that caused the most problems in the etiquette of the day was precedence. Who is above who? And it was a very complex system that was not easily deciphered. Who would sit at the table closer to the king? Who is announced in what order? And the funniest one for me is the chairs. There are basically three types of chairs. There's the armchair, the armless chair, and the three-legged stool. What chair you sat in told everybody who you were. And it would get to the point where, and I read an anecdote about a mother-in-law coming to visit the son-in-law's family, and they had to negotiate what chair each person would sit in before she would visit. And it's not just who you think you are to sit in any given chair, but it's who you are in relation to the person you're with determines what chair you get to sit in. In this particular case, the son-in-law was going to sit in an armchair. The mother-in-law would not have it. You do not sit in an armchair in my presence. You get an armless chair. And they would negotiate. And in the end, the visit was called off because he insisted. Now, he probably didn't mind that his mother-in-law was not going to come visit him. But that's just a mother-in-law joke. So, another really interesting one, a lot of the rooms will have double doors. Depending on who you are, the butler or the valet or whoever would either open one door or both doors. And there was another anecdote about a woman who was, the butler had opened both doors for her to enter into a particular room, and the woman who was in the room was outraged and wanted to fire that butler. How dare you open two doors for that woman? She only deserves one door. I'll have your job for this. And of course, whether you stand or sit in the presence of anybody in particular was very important as well. If they were significantly higher in rank than you, you do not sit at all on any occasion. And of course, as I said, you could be banished from court for a breach of etiquette, which for some people would be like Adam and Eve being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And Louis, as I've said, wanted to present himself as a king at all times. And he was watched at all times. And so he had a schedule, and it was said that no matter where you were in France, if you knew what time it was, you knew what King Louis was doing, or at least in a general idea. So at 7:45, his valet, who slept in the room on a fold-up cot, would get up to start prepare things. The wood carrier would come in to start the fire if it was wintertime and cold. The royal watchmaker would come in to wind the royal watch. And of course, the all-important wig maker would come in to present a couple of wigs for Louis to choose from. And Louis loved his wigs. He started losing his hair right around 30 or so. And so he didn't start to wear wigs until his 30s. But once he did, he had a wide array of wigs to choose from. There was the morning wig that he would wear as he put his clothes on. There was the council wig that he would wear at council. The hunting wig and on and on. The evening wig, the walking wig, just dozens of wigs for all occasions. So the king would rise at the first stroke of 8. Probably he would be laying in bed waiting for that moment, because you wouldn't want to rise a minute earlier or a minute later, right on the first stroke of 8. And it was announced throughout the palace, the king has risen. And everybody would make that note in their own mind. Have you heard? The king has risen. It's 8 o'clock. He's gotten up. As if that were a big event. Two doctors come in to give him a rub down. He has a nurse. Isn't this cute? He has a nurse to come in and kiss him good morning, to say, how did you sleep last night? Wouldn't we all like to have that? So he had his holy water brought to him, and in what I've read, it didn't really give me an explanation as to what he would do with it. Is there any good Catholics in here who can tell me what the king would do with the holy water brought to him in the morning? I imagine he would either sprinkle on himself and maybe cross himself, or
Bless himself.
he'd bless himself, okay. And this is the time, if you are, and there would be several nobles there present watching all of this. Great honor to be in his presence, watching the routine of the morning. Something you tell your grandkids about, and they would sit in awe listening to you discuss how the king got dressed in the morning. But this is the time when the nobility who are present would ask favors of the king, and he would grant them if it were in his power and not too extravagant. And so he puts on his wig and he puts on his clothes. Now I was told, or at least I've read, that he put his own clothes on. He did not have people dress him, but they would be, the honor would be to hand King Louis his clothes one at a time, and each person would have a particular piece of clothing that they would hand to him, and he would put them on. And we have a description. Sometimes the dukes would write to their families and discuss how wonderful it was to watch the king dress himself. And he did it so cleverly and gracefully. It's wonderful to see how graceful and clever the king is in putting his shirt and pants on. And it was said that he would shave every other day, or at least he would have the royal barber shave him every other day. And you must know, too, that washing yourself was not something that was very common. The king did take baths occasionally. It's like that joke, you take a bath every Sunday night whether you need it or not. It was probably less than that. But he would wash his hands with a mixture of wine and water and some sort of scented something or other in the water. And he would have a glass of wine that he would drink mixed with water. Then he would say his prayers. Now the clergymen that would be present at this time would kneel down with him and pray. The nobility, the laity there in the room would not. They would stand and watch. And then he would give the schedule of the day. What's going to happen in that particular day. Then he would go to Mass, and then he would have his council meetings. Louis XIV could eat like no one else. He loved food, and he ate an amazing amount. He often ate alone, or at least he was the only one eating. He was never alone. People would watch him, as I say, in virtually everything he did. But he ate alone, and he would eat and eat, and eat. And I have here, where is that? Okay. Okay, I have it in the notes. I was going to read it. Forks were not in use at that time. It was forks were only invented sometime in the Middle Ages, but were not widely used until much later. Forks, after 1700 or so, they started being in use, but King Louis never used a fork. So he would eat with his hands, unless it was soup, of course, he'd have a spoon, but everything is pretty much with your hands. No one was to speak while Louis was eating, and he never spoke as he ate either. And as I said, the kitchen was literally hundreds of yards away and would be brought to him. So you wonder if he ever had a warm meal. Although they did have something in the way of a hot plate where there'd be hot coals underneath the plates. And here's a famous painting of Louis eating with Moliere, and I've lost my French.
That was right, though.
Yeah.
That was right.
Yeah.
The pronunciation was right.
Moliere. Very good. So this is one of the times where he actually ate with another person, but you'll notice all the people standing around watching. Again, a great honor to be able to watch the king eat his meal. And as I said, he was a prodigious eater. A typical meal would be 4 bowls of soup, a pheasant, a partridge, 2 slices of ham, a salad, some mutton with garlic, some pastries, some fruit, and some hard-boiled eggs. And, of course, he would have a nighttime snack of, say, small loaves of bread with some meat and a few bottles of wine to tide him over. It was said that upon his death, they did an autopsy, and the doctors said that his stomach was twice the size of a normal human being's. Louis, as I said earlier, was a lover, or at least he was very lustful, and he was often indiscriminate about the women that he chose to have sex with. He was not indiscriminate about who he would have an affair with, but he did a lot of one-night stands that he could be going after the washerwoman or any of the ladies in waiting, and he was even known to sneak about during the night, climb on the roof of the palace to find an open window for the ladies in waiting room to sneak in and have a one-night stand with one of them. He slept with his wife approximately once a month, just for show, I suppose. And he did need an heir, so that was important too. But as I mentioned before, with Henry VIII, of course, the king and the queen had their own separate rooms. And anytime the king slept with the queen, that was an announced thing, that the king was going to sleep with his wife tonight, and everybody would know. His younger brother, who was most probably gay, who loved to dress in women's clothes, who appeared to love or enjoy the company of men rather than women, was married to an English princess, and Louis fell in love with her. And he probably did not have an affair with her because she refused him. But she gave him a consolation prize in the form of one of her ladies in waiting. And he fell in love with her and had an ongoing affair and a child or two. And that's one of the pictures you have, Louis de la Valliere. And Louis, after a few years of this, and once Louis moved on to the next affair, eventually went into a nunnery and became a nun for the rest of her life, which was not uncommon for a woman who had been used by a king and abandoned. It was the sensible thing to do to go join a nunnery. His next affair was, I suppose you say madam, right? M-M-E, is that madam? Madame?
Yeah.
De Montespan, who was a very proud, outgoing sort of woman, and he had her for a few years, had a couple of kids with her before moving on. Here's Louis with Louis de la Valliere. Beautiful painting. And there is Madame de Montespan. Louis, as in many things, his women, he loved, as I say, he loved women. Everybody knew he loved being around women. He was always polite towards them, always gracious towards them, but he didn't really care about their comfort. If they were traveling in a coach, Louis loved the air. No matter what season or what the temperature, he always had the coach windows open. Whether it was really hot, whether it was really cold, whether it was raining, the coach windows were always open. And when Louis wanted to stop, he would stop. If the woman in the coach wanted to stop, she better keep her mouth closed, because that would be inconvenient to Louis. He did not care if you were uncomfortable. He did not care if you had to use the restroom. You do not tell Louis that you need to stop the coach. He did not care. And he also never wanted to trust them in matters of state. And I have a quote here that's very telling. In his younger years, in his 20s, he said to his friends, and this one isn't on your handout, but he said to his friends, "I order all of you, if you notice that any woman shows the least sign of managing me, to warn me. I shall then need only 24 hours to get rid of her." That's what he thought of women. They were to be used for your pleasure and nothing else. Except for his last woman. Madame de Maintenon, she was a little bit older than Louis. She was the governess of his bastard children at age 35. And she was a very proper, very pious, and dutiful, and very intelligent woman. She loved Louis's children and cared for them much more than the mothers of these bastard children. It was said that one of the children was dying of some illness, and the mother, I believe it was Madame de Maintenon, who was the mother, didn't care to sit at the bedside of this dying child of hers. But the other one was Madame de Montespan. Got to get these right. I always get these two mixed up. Madame de Maintenon, who was the governess, did spend hours and hours with this dying child. And Louis loved children, especially his own. And he thought that was a wonderful thing, that this woman would care so much for his bastard children, and the mother did not. And here she is, Madame de Maintenon. She came from a very low background. It was said that she was born in prison and raised in a very low state. But she was very intelligent, and as she grew, and here's a quote from her, very interesting sort of woman. I did not desire to be loved in particular by anybody. I wished my name to be uttered with admiration and respect. She was not a romantic type, but she was very proper, much like Louis, except that he was kind of the romantic type. But he fell in love with her. And when his wife died, Maria dies in 1683, he married Madame de Maintenon, who was, Louis was 46 at this time. Madame de Maintenon was a couple of years older. Louis, now that he remarried, stopped all of his affairs. No one ever found any trace of him trying to cheat on his new wife. No more mistresses. And he became more religious than he was. His religion was always a very formal sort of thing, as virtually everything about him was. He became something more religious at this time. And he did discuss matters of state with her. And this is a period of time, the great flowering of French culture, the culture of France, taking a lot of the lessons of the Renaissance earlier, was now flowering in the place of Italy. And so Louis, as a part of this, he loved promoting the arts and sciences. This is the age of Baroque. He promoted, this is when opera and ballet were virtually invented. And he loved concerts and masques and plays. The great philosophers of Spinoza and Leibniz were around at this time. And the great dramatists, the French, we have our Shakespeare, they have their Molière and Racine. Louis' religion, as I say, it was more formal than personal, and believed very strongly in his own chosen status as king. He was at first reluctantly tolerant of the Protestants in France, who were called the Huguenots, and others who were dissidents. But as he aged and once he remarried, that changed. He became very intolerant. He revoked what was the Edict of Nantes, which was the Toleration Act towards the Huguenots, and began a horrible persecution of them. And so thousands were killed, thousands had forced conversions, and thousands fled France, which is a great loss for France, since a lot of the Huguenots were of the mercantile class, the hard workers of the country. And many of them were put in the galleys as slaves. So here's a map kind of showing how upwards of 200,000 Huguenots fled France at this time to various other countries. Some of them came to America, as we know, in the colonial era. Louis at war. One of the terribly unfortunate things about Louis was that he loved war to build up his own prestige and the prestige of France. It was necessary to almost constantly be at war with his neighbors. He fought 3 major wars and 2 minor ones, and he was usually successful. He had a very good general staff. His administration, one of the things that Louis was good at was choosing who his administrators were, and choosing for talent and not name. One of the things about his ministers, as I said earlier, he did not trust the nobility. He never chose any of the nobility as any of his ministers. they were all from the lower classes, except in the army. He did hire some generals who were from the nobility. He was usually pretty successful, but what he was really good at was diplomacy. He knew how to split his enemies into varying camps by either bribery or just outright lying in treaties. His idea of a treaty was just something that would temporarily mollify some neighbor into not fighting against him. And of course, as I've said before, wars are always very expensive, and the taxes that needed to be raised were ruinous to the French people. The last war, and the worst of them all, was the War of Spanish Succession. This was about who would inherit the crown of Spain. And of course, Spain, when you inherit the crown of Spain, it's not just Spain. You have the overseas empires in Latin America, you have the Philippines, you have the Spice Islands, some of those out in that area, and you have some European territories as well. Belgium was considered a territory of Spain, and several territories in Italy as well. Because as you know, Italy was not a country. It was a collection of various duchies and territories that would be traded almost like trading cards amongst the various kings and sovereigns of the day. And so, who should inherit the Spanish crown? He had no heirs, no direct heirs, and so who's the nearest one? Well, it just happened to be either Louis or Leopold, who was the Holy Roman Emperor. Both of them were descendants of Spanish kings, and both of them had married Spanish wives who were descendant of kings. Louis claimed that he had the greater, the closer, I'm losing my mind here. He thought he was closer in that his wife and his mother were older than Leopold's wife and mother. They were the elder, so they should have precedence. Leopold pointed out, however, to Louis that both your mother and your wife renounced their inheritance upon coming to France. Mine did not. And of course, Louis would retort back, well, that was only if we got the payment, the dowry. The dowry was not entirely paid, so that whole renunciation is null and void. So this is the negotiations that would go back and forth. However, both of them realized that war would happen unless negotiations were made. Both of them knew that they had to give and take in this process. So they decided that Spain needed to be, the territories needed to be distributed amongst the various nations in order to make this equitable. So they had a treaty of partition to partition the territories, and it was agreed that Leopold's grandson would be given the crown. Not everybody was entirely happy with that, but it was the closest thing that they were going to get at the time. Unfortunately, Charles, who was the king, Charles II of Spain, who was the king when he found out about this, and the Spanish people in general, were outraged that these foreign countries are dividing up the Spanish territories, as if Spain itself had nothing to do with it. So Charles, he was called Charles the Sufferer because he had the unique ability to appear to be dying for 30 years. And these negotiations, people have been talking about it for a long time because they always thought he was dying. And what are we going to do about Spain because the king is going to be dead before too long? Well, about 1700, the time had come, and he really was dying. And so he decided that the best course, because he didn't like the idea of splitting up the empire, he was going to give it into the hands of the most powerful sovereign. And so he was going to give it to France. It was going to be Louis's grandson that in his will he was giving the crown to. So Charles dies, and Louis accepted it. He said, wow, I wasn't expecting this, but this is pretty good. My grandson is going to get the crown. And of course, that did not make Leopold very happy. It did not make England very happy. William III, William of Orange, as King of England, wasn't very happy about it either. So the War of Spanish Succession, 12 years of war, was going to decide the issue. So you have England, you have the Netherlands, the Holy Roman Empire, which includes several territories, mainly the German states. We're all fighting. And once again, the sufferers in this were the French people mostly, whose taxes paid for it all. And during this time, England has a new hero. John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough. And if that name sounds familiar, it is because it is. Winston Churchill's ancestor was John Churchill. And Winston Churchill actually wrote a biography of his ancestor, very thick volume about the Duke of Marlborough. So he led his army, very rarely lost a battle, defeats the French army, which was almost considered invincible. They had been known for a long time as a very powerful army. So, Duke of Marlborough, the hero of the war. And if you don't think England thought highly of him, look at this picture. As if he's chosen by God to defeat his enemies. So after 12 years, they had the final settlement. Louis's grandson keeps the crown, but the territories are divided up. The map that I've given you on your handout isn't so much to show you the precise division of any empire. It's more to show you how Italy and Germany neither one of them were a country per se. They were several territories in the general area of each other. So Belgium went to Austria. The Italian territories go to Leopold. And England gets special trade privileges, which they really coveted. And Europe got to rest from a devastating war. And once again, the people of France several times had risen up in revolt against their leaders. The final years of Louis. During all this time, Louis had lost several of his family. His son died, his only son is dead, and two of his grandkids were dead. His daughter-in-law died. And so he was suffering quite a bit at this time. And Louis was no longer the great king that everyone loved. When he died, they celebrated because the people in general had suffered terribly in this whole time. And there's the death of Louis XIV. Questions, comments, anything else? Okay, no, yes.
On the map you gave us, there's some shading in kind of the middle of Spain. Is that other territories?
Well, you know, Portugal is on one side, right?
Yeah.
And then you have the Aragon and Castile. That's the division there, I believe. Oh, no. Yeah, actually, I'm not sure what that is. Sorry. Yes?
All these rituals you talk about, were these started by Louis, or were these typical of the royalty?
I think Louis, I doubt that he initiated very many of them, but he cemented them into a ritual that you could, like I said, you could count on. You look at your watch and count on Louis doing exactly the same thing every day, almost without fail. So I'm sure there are some things that were started in his time, but it was mostly stuff that was more just cemented in as a real routine. Yes?
Off the wall question.
Yes.
You mentioned earlier in your lecture that in Louis' early time as king, Latin was the language of diplomacy. Was it under Louis that French finally became what we call today the lingua franca?
Yes. Because during his reign is when France became the power, the superpower of Europe. During the many wars that he fought up until that time. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much. So next week is Napoleon, and I have to announce that the final week I'm going to have to cancel. And that was going to be Gandhi, but I'm going to have to cancel that because I have a job I have to go to. So, got to be responsible. All right, thank you.
So next week is it.